All right, these notes are going to go over something known as the discriminant and the quadratic formula. When an equation cannot be factored or solved by square roots, in order to find those roots, there is a formula that will get you the solutions or those x-intercepts, and the formula will give them to you in decimal format. So I'm going to show you how all of this kind of pulls everything together. If you memorize this formula, there will be some extra credit points given for that. If you don't, the formula sheet will have it on there, so don't beat yourself up over trying to remember it unless it's just very easy for you to remember. All right, the first thing we want to do is talk about this word discriminant and what it means and what it tells you and how you would figure it out. The discriminant is the value under the radical sign of the quadratic formula. And because you don't know what the quadratic formula is right now, I will go ahead and give you the discriminant so that you can see what it is and what it looks like. The discriminant is simply the expression b squared minus 4ac. Right, so that's what you're going to use to help you figure out that value. Right, so there will be some problems that ask you to find the discriminant. And if that's all it wants to know, then you use that formula and you give the numerical value for the discriminant. Right, but that numerical value is going to give you some information. Right, so what we'll do is an example of how this works, and I will show you how to deal with it. Right, so we're going to take one equation, x squared minus 3x minus 4 equals 0. In order to do this, you do have to have your quadratic equations in standard form, so they have to say equals 0. Otherwise, you can't pick your a, b, and c values out the correct way. Right, and if you remember what standard form looked like, it was ax squared plus bx plus c. When it's in order, your a value is your leading coefficient in front of the x squared, your b value is in front of the x, your c value is the constant in the back. Take those values and actually plug them in, right? So when we're plugging into b squared minus 4ac, it's going to be negative 3, because that's your b value, squared, make sure you use parentheses, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 4. So that's just taking the letters out and putting the numbers in. Now you want to mathematically calculate that, right? Well, going through and either using your calculator or order of operations, you would do exponents first, so that would make a positive 9 here. When you multiply negative 4 times 1 times negative 4, that gives you a positive 16. And then 9 plus 16 is 25. So the discriminant value for this equation is positive 25. Right? Now, the only information that that's going to give you, it doesn't really mean a whole lot in terms of graphing or plotting, right? But what it does tell you, right, is how many answers you're going to have, right? So the next piece I want you to write down is why the discriminant is important, right? The discriminant can be used to determine how many roots an equation has. Now, we've also gotten really good at using our calculators, and we know that if we graph it on the calculator, we can also determine how many roots it's going to have. But this discriminant value does give it to us. And just like when you were solving equations, there was 3 scenarios. When the discriminant comes out being one of these 3 possibilities, you've got 3 scenarios as well. Right? So the first one is if the discriminant is positive, then that means that you have 2 roots. Just like in an equation, when you go to square root it, if it's a positive number that you're taking the square root of, you're going to have the plus and minus sign. Same thing happens with the discriminant. If it's a positive number, like the example in number 1 had, then that means when you see your graph of the parabola, it's going to cross that x-axis in 2 places. Those are your 2 roots. So your graph will look like something like that. And it can go upwards or downwards. It really doesn't matter. Okay, so that's if the discriminant is positive. If the discriminant is 0, then that means there is 1 root to the problem. It doesn't mean that it is at 0 though. It just means that the parabola will touch the x-axis at 1 spot. So your graph, right, could look something like this, where the parabola only touches at 1 number on that x-axis instead of 2, right? So that's if your discriminant comes out to be 0. Then the third scenario is if the discriminant is negative. And if this is a negative, just like when you were solving square roots, if you have a negative number and try to square root it, it has no real roots because it's never going to cross the x-axis. So the picture of a problem that has a negative discriminant would be some sort of parabola, okay, that never crosses that x-axis. So those are your three scenarios, and that's really all that the discriminant is good for, is to give you another way to determine how many solutions or roots you would have. Okay, but this discriminant is all a big part of one formula that is known as the quadratic formula, and it can only be used when we're dealing with quadratic equations. That's why its name is the way it is. All right, so let me get the board to cooperate here. All right, and with the quadratic formula, it's going to look kind of scary and weird, but it's just a matter of plugging everything in, right? When you do the quadratic formula, the biggest thing you have to remember is that you always get two answers. And most of the time, they are decimals just because of the way the formula works out. And you'll see as soon as I show you what it looks like, and once we start plugging things in, you've actually done the quadratic formula with numbers already in place. You've not substituted into the formula. So you'll recognize it once you actually see what's going on here. All right, but this is used when factoring is not possible. Now, you can use the quadratic formula anytime you want to for any type of quadratic equation, but it is most needed when factoring is not possible, okay, because otherwise factoring and other things can get you there a lot faster. All right, but here's the formula. It's negative b plus or minus radical, and under the radical sign is b squared minus 4ac. That's that discriminant piece that we talked about right above. Okay, all of it is divided by 2 times a. So it looks kind of scary, but if you take and plug it in the way it's supposed to and you take it one piece at a time, okay, the formula is really not difficult to deal with. Okay, so the only thing that I'm going to give you here next is some examples that will help you to figure out how to use the formula. Okay, we're only going to do a couple of them because on your test that you take with me, you'll only have to be able to do one or two. All right, so the first one that I'm going to show you how to do, okay, is if we have negative 3y squared plus 2y plus 8 equals 0, right? And you're told you have to use the quadratic formula no matter what, right? So that's what we're going to do, right? So the first thing you always want to do is identify who your a, b, and c are. A is negative 3, b is positive 2, and c is 8 in this case, right? So now we're going to plug things in, right? So in the negative b spot, that means that whatever b is, it becomes the opposite of it. So since it's positive 2, it's going to turn negative 2 in the formula. Then you need the plus minus sign, square root. B squared would be 2 squared minus 4 times a, which is negative 3, times c, which is 8. All of that is divided by 2 times negative 3. Right? And then we want to clean it up. If you were going to type this entire thing in your calculator, I urge you to be super cautious because you forget one little piece of this problem or you don't type it in the right way and the calculator will not give you the right answer. My advice to you is to clean this thing up first and then use the calculator in a better way. All right, so if you're going to clean it up, then get it to this point. You want it negative 2 here, plus or minus. Get one number under the radical sign so that you don't have to deal with that whole long mess. Okay, and remember, order of operations must happen. So 2 squared becomes 4. Negative 4 times negative 3 is positive 12. 12 times 8 is going to make 96, so it's a positive 96. So now you've got 4 plus 96. That leaves us with 100 under the radical sign, which is a whole lot easier to deal with than typing in all of that. And then on the bottom, you would have 2 times negative 3, which is negative 6. This should look like something you've already done when we talked about evaluating with square roots. So use that. You have to have two answers. Now, the square root of 100 actually comes out pretty nicely for us. All right, so when we go to do this, you don't have to necessarily use the calculator, all right, unless you feel like you need to. Square root of 100 is definitely 10. All right, so your two problems are negative 2 plus 10 divided by negative 6. Get that answer. And negative 2 minus 10 divided by negative 6 and get that answer. Right? And you can have decimals or you can leave them as fractions in this case. Negative 2 plus 10 is going to give you a positive 8. divided by negative 6, which reduces to negative 4/3. You can leave me with negative 4/3, or if you want to turn it to the decimal, because that's what we're operating with, negative 1.33 would be sufficient enough, because remember, round to the hundreds place. For the bottom one, negative 2 minus 10 is negative 12, divided by negative 6. That's an easy division problem. It comes out to be positive 2. Right? So your two answers for this quadratic formula are positive 2 and negative 1.33. Okay, and you do want to take and put them in those braces that we've always been using. Okay, so the quadratic formula gives you your two roots that factoring would not have otherwise gotten you to get. All right, so let's do one more practice problem with it, and then we'll come to class and you'll take and practice some more with it, and we'll make sure that you know how to plug things in and what to do with it. Okay, but it really isn't as big of a deal as it may look to be. All right, so let's go ahead and take 7x squared minus 1 equals negative 2x. Right, now in order to do this, you can't just pick a, b, and c out of your equation unless it's in standard form. This problem is not in standard form. So you might want to remind yourself, put in standard form. Okay, because it's the only way that the quadratic formula will work. All right, so once we move the minus 2x over, we're going to have 7x squared. It'll be plus 2x minus 1 equals 0. Now we have it in standard form. Our a value is 7, our b value is positive 2, and our c value is negative 1. Now you can start plugging it into the quadratic formula to get your two roots. All right, so for negative b, that would be negative 2 plus or minus square root. B squared is 2 squared minus 4 times a, which is 7, times c, which is negative 1. Okay, divided by 2 times a, which is 7. All right, so again, clean it up so that you have one number under the radical sign and the bottom doesn't have multiplication still left on it. Okay, and then you can use your calculator from there. So negative 2 plus or minus radical, and let's get that one number that's under there. 2 squared turns into 4, and then negative 4 times 7 is negative 28. Negative 28 times negative 1 is a positive 28. Okay, so 4 plus 28 is going to make 32 under that radical sign. Okay, and then we're going to divide by 2 times 7, which is 14. So now you're at the problem where you can type it in safely into that calculator and get your two decimal values. Remember, you got to have two problems, negative 2 plus radical 32 divided by 14 and negative 2 minus radical 32 divided by 14. When you type both of these in, you should come up with decimals that have been rounded to the hundreds place, and they should be 0.26 and negative 0.55. Okay, if you are not getting those values, then we need to look at how you're typing the numbers into the calculator and whether you're even using the right numbers, right? So we're going to keep practicing with this. It will show up on your test. There won't be a whole lot of them, but you'll have to know how to use the formula, okay? And we'll go from there.